JP Guidry here with pillar number 2. Today we're going to talk about mobility. Now, in my experience, I've been working with golfers for close to 10 years. Most golfers think this is the main area they need to make improvements in. And while it is very important to our health, to our performance, I think it does get a little bit overblown sometimes when it comes to golf. I still go back to pillar number 1, which is building the strength base as the lowest hanging fruit for most golfers. But in the end, having good mobility and specifically having mobility in the areas we need for golf is still very important. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about what I mean by mobility. So what mobility is that's your ability to take all of your joints or whatever joint we're talking about through a full range of motion for the movements in that joint, and then being able to control that range of motion, and then lastly being able to carry that over into the needs for that particular joint for your sport or activity of choice. So for golf, there's some general areas that we really need to move well in. Those are, we need to have the ability to separate or disassociate our upper and lower body. We need to be able to rotate through our hip joints. We need to be able to tilt our pelvis forward and backwards. We need to be able to rotate through our thoracic spine, our mid-back, and our rib cage. And we need to have good mobility through our shoulder joint and shoulder complex. In these areas, it's necessary that a golfer has proficient, so enough range of motion, has the ability to control that range of motion in those joints, has good strength throughout the full range of motion in that joint, and then needs to be able to expel all that together in the golf swing. When I talk about mobility, most of my clients, I have them work on some kind of mobility on a daily basis, as well as work that into their workouts. And then obviously spending, so we work on kind of general whole body mobility for health and for the golf performance, but also spending more time obviously on the areas where there may be limitations. When I'm having clients do mobility exercises, I like to have them move throughout the full range. I like to have them play with moving in and out of the end of the range where they may feel some restriction or tightness. I like to have them breathe into that restriction. We can add some holds into that restriction. And there's a lot of ways you can kind of work through this, and they all can have some success. So when we talk about approaching range of motion or mobility, the main thing we want to do is kind of follow a layered approach. So the first step is active range of motion. So that's just moving your joint or joints through the full range of motion. If you're tight or if you're restricted, then there's a chance that there's a part of that joint that quote unquote hasn't been engaged. And that means the muscles and the joint itself hasn't been taken into that new range of motion, and the muscles have not been used in that new range of motion. So when we do that, it's the old kind of, if you don't use it, you lose it standpoint, meaning that we lose our ability both from a tissue extensibility standpoint in that range, but also our nervous system and the way our movement is controlled gets kind of dampened down and kind of turned off, for lack of better words, in that new range. So when we expand new range of motion through active range of motion, then we want to start to add a load and strengthen into that new range of motion. And this can be, adding some kind of resistance on top of that via dumbbells, free weights, bands, or this can be something that is now taking a full body movement, let's say a squat. You've improved your hip mobility. Now we can squat a little deeper, and we can load that and maintain our hip mobility. And then carrying all of that over again to the sport. So then we get into the technical side for, let's say, okay, now you've got some more rotation. How do we get you to use that in the golf swing, which is going to come more on the coaching, the professional side, teaching pro side, is putting that together. And that's why it helps to have a good team of both fitness and PGA professionals around you to help put all that together. So the most important thing is to remember that the mobility isn't just kind of one kind of exercise. It's a very layered approach. You can improve mobility through strength training. You can improve mobility through mobility focused exercises. You can improve mobility through improving your mechanics of the golf swing and putting all of that together. And so don't get too caught up in separating it necessarily from anything else you're doing to improve your performance and improve your health. So, what we want to talk about today is we'll talk a little bit about each area. We'll dive into each area as it relates to the golf swing and how we can improve those. And again, you'll have access to the PDF, which will have links to all the exercises. The main exercises that I prescribe for each area for most clients. So we talked about active mobility, loaded mobility, that type of thing. So before we start, I have a few little self-movement screens that you can take yourself through. It's a quick little upper quarter screen, upper body, and a lower quarter screen. So what you want to do with this is you want to look for a few things. You want to look at feel. So when you're moving limbs or moving in two different directions, you want to compare one side to the other. How does it feel? Does one side feel more free? Does one side feel more restricted? Or, is it very obvious that you can't move as well on one side than the other? Also looking for pain, discomfort, that type of thing. If it's very severe pain, then we don't want to force that, and that may be a sign of where you need to get further evaluated by a medical professional. If it's more kind of discomfort because of the restriction or the tightness, then that's more of a sign, okay, we need to spend some time working on improving that area. So we want to maintain and improve our general mobility, and then we want to spend some extra time working on the areas where we see some limitations. And that's the importance of this little screen, taking yourself through the screen and having kind of an idea, okay, these are the areas that I'm limited in. Obviously when I'm working with a client, this is something I'm taking them through day one and then continuing to look at as we move along. So let's start in the first area. Let's start with disassociation or separation of the upper lower body. So this is the ability to separate, to rotate a upper body on a stable lower body, and vice versa, rotate the lower body on a stable upper body. This is hugely important for the rotational athlete, for sequencing, for creating that quote unquote X factor and doing it, in a healthy way. That allows us to, create the swing from the ground up, and it allows us to create more power. So this is really where mobility has a huge play in power and distance, is creating that separation, creating that sequencing. Some of the times it's a kind of coordination issue. It's just something you need to work on coordinating. And then some of the times you just don't have the mobility to do it. A lot of times it's a little bit of both. And they both need to probably be worked on. So, but this is a very important part to work on in your game. Learning to be able to move one segment, a lower segment, lower body, without the upper body going with it, and vice versa. Next is pelvic tilting. Okay. And what I mean by this is, so if you take your pelvis and let's think of it as a bucket of water. If we're going to pour water out the front of the pelvis, that's going to be anterior tilting. So we're tilting anteriorly, we're dropping that front of that pelvis. If we were going to pour the water out of the back of the pelvis, that's going to be posterior tilting. Posterior pelvic tilting engages more the glutes and the core, so it puts us in a little more stable position. Anterior pelvic tilting engages more the spinal erectors and the hip flexors. So the pelvis needs to move through both positions throughout the golf swing. There's a great slow motion video of Rory on YouTube somewhere of his pelvis, kind of close up on his pelvis when he's coming from transition into the downswing, and his pelvis is going from an anterior tilted position to a posterior tilted position. And that part of that is what helps keep him in a spine angle, helps create stability through the core, and helps create a powerful swing, hitting down and through the ball. So it is an important part of the golf swing, both for mechanics of the swing, for power development, and then it does getting off in those positions can put some more stress on the lumbar spine, on the low back. Also, those with tight, quote unquote, tight hamstrings, pay attention to your pelvis, because if you have a very anteriorly tilted pelvis normally, your bucket is pouring out the front. That's going to tension the hamstrings, and it's going to mask, or it's going to look like hamstring tightness when it may be a pelvis position thing. And so, working on having to control that posterior anterior mobility. And it's also important when squatting, when deadlifting heavy, kind of staying in more of a neutral position between the both, and being able to control that and keep that with a heavy load, for safety and for strength. Let's talk about hip mobility. So we're going to look at hip mobility from all aspects. Obviously, from the main importance to the golfer is hip rotation. There's some research out there connecting lack of hip internal rotation. So that would be turning into your hip. So turning into the lead hip on the downswing, turning into the trail hip on the backswing. There's some connections with limitations in that and back pain. And it just kind of, whether it forces compensations or, just puts more stress on the lumbar spine over time. So, having good hip rotation, especially internal rotation, is an important thing for golfers, for health, for movement, power development, all the above. So having the ability to rotate in and out of our hips, and then also just general hip mobility, flexion, extension, the other movements are important as well. Not as important as the hip rotation when it comes to the golf swing. So when we rotate, we want to rotate through the hips. We want to stay stable through the midsection. We want to rotate through the thoracic spine and rib cage, which we'll get to next. And so for the thoracic spine and rib cage, if you think of that from the bottom of your rib cage to your upper chest, mid back, we really want to be able to rotate through there. A lot of golfers I see, they're limited with that. What is this going to do? It's going to limit your ability to turn into your backswing. So you either have to shorten your swing, or you have to start to compensate by standing up, extending through the spine, getting more arm movement. And then it affects your ability to get open through impact. So I think the average for PGA Tour players is hips are 60 degrees open, torso is 40 degrees open at impact. That's a lot of rotation to have at impact. That's at impact, not even past impact. And so if you physically can't do that, then everything else doesn't matter as far as what you're trying to get in the golf swing. So we need to be able to rotate through the hips. We need to be able to rotate through the thoracic spine, as well as be able to flex, extend through the thoracic spine. So that's going to be more posture related, not getting too rounded in posture, but also not necessarily getting too upright. A little bit of flexion isn't necessarily a bad thing. And that's every club to the bag for posture, obviously. Lastly, we have the shoulder complex. And what I mean by the shoulder complex is our shoulder joint and then the shoulder blade. And you can even kind of throw in the thoracic spine around that, the rib cage, because the shoulder blade has to work around that. But they all work together when we move. With the golf swing, we need a few things. So with our trail arm, we need the ability to external rotate. So if you look in the video in the corner, that's external rotation from the side. That's external rotation. So when we're getting to the top and trying to shallow on that downswing to stay on plane or come from the inside, you need that ability to do that. Otherwise, you're going to try to get that from extending through the spine, standing up, or doing, maybe sliding, too much side bend, all kind of ways you can kind of work around that. So that's probably the most important movement when it comes to the shoulder complex specific to the golf swing. We also need some horizontal adduction to, that's our arm coming across our chest, especially into that lead arm. So when we're turning into it, to kind of keep those hands back. But we also want just to maintain the health of our shoulders. So having good rotation through the shoulders, having good elevation, so to be able to take our arms overhead, having good adduction coming across the body, abduction going away from the body, um, is good for our shoulder health with golf and with everything we do, as well as it does take pressure off the elbow, wrist, and hands when we do that. So sometimes with elbow issues, tennis elbow, golfer's elbow, we can look at the shoulder as well and find some lack of mobility there. So those are the main big areas we want to move well through for the golf swing. So again, we need to be able to separate our upper and lower body. We need to be able to rotate well through the hips. We need to be able to anterior and posterior tilt our pelvis, pour that water out of the bucket forward and backwards. We need to be able to rotate well through our thoracic spine and rib cage, and we need to have good mobility through our shoulder complex. So this is important. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. I would really just find the areas you need to focus on. Maybe make a daily practice of whole body movement, 5 to 10 minutes, and then spend more time in your workouts working on the areas you need to work on. But still, prioritizing strength and then power development, which we'll get into in pillar number 3. But as for overall health, and especially for the older population, mobility tends to become more of a priority as well. So if you have any questions, reach out to me at johnpaul@guidrypt.com, and I look forward to the next lesson.